Syria has new leadership. Islamist rebels who forced former President Bashar al-Assad to flee over the weekend. And this is what their leader said after their victory.
This victory is a new chapter in the history of our Islamic nation. Within 11 days, Syria was liberated from north to south and from east to west. Thanks to God, we have witnessed with our own eyes how 13 years of suffering are being healed through this great victory.
So what happens next after this great victory? What role will the man that you just saw play in it? And what about Turkey that supported many of the rebels? Is what we are discussing today on News Desk. I'm Biresh Banerjee. Welcome.
And I'm Amien Essif. I'm going to be having an eye on the chat, so please post your comments and your questions, and I'll bring that into the conversation.
And before you bring that into the conversation, it's worth introducing people sat at the table, right? It's always a good idea.
I think so.
Pablo, Foley, Elias in his striped shirt today.
Hello,
looking
everybody.
Fantastic.
Good to see everyone.
Pablo is going to be providing us context and the latest information, perhaps.
That's right.
On what is happening in Syria, fast-moving events.
Absolutely.
Cherie Chan, whom you all have seen before as well, is going to be talking to you guys in the chat. She's going to be in the and taking your questions and bringing them into the conversation as well.
Monitoring the comments, so behave, guys.
So if I don't get to your questions, then yell at her, not me.
So Cherie is going to be looking at all of these comments and talking to you guys. In the interim, I think you've been looking at a few comments that have already dropped.
Yeah, that's right. We have already, in our community post, have gotten some people asking some questions. First, starting off with a comment from Brendan Sunraw. Thanks for that. He says, whoever governs Syria will have to contend with the choice between Kurdish forces and Turkey. To keep Syria from falling into separation, the loyalty of SDF, that's Kurdish-backed forces, and other Kurdish factions will be crucial. On the other hand, Turkey has the materials and expertise needed to rebuild Syria's infrastructure. That's one perspective that we're going to be talking about definitely as we get into talking about Turkey's role. And It's a Games asks a very direct question: why is Turkey part of NATO? So hopefully we'll be able to answer that question as well.
We will be looking at the role of Turkey, but not just the role of Turkey, but we'll also be looking at the question of the Kurdish rebels who are on the border with Turkey. And we'll be doing this in a bit with DW correspondent in Turkey, Dorian Jones, and also we'll be talking to Syria analyst Natasha Hall, who will be joining us from DC, hopefully. That's going to be happening in just a short bit. But Cherie, besides looking at the community and monitoring the chat so that the questions can be brought into the conversation, you will also be looking at a poll, won't you?
Yeah, as usual, we have a poll question for you. Today we are asking, what should Syria's new rulers do first? There are 4 options. The first one is to rebuild the economy. Second, negotiate with rebel factions. The third, ensure minority rights. And the last one is to achieve international recognition. So remember to vote and let us know your opinion about this question, and then we'll talk about the result later.
I'm really interested in what the results of this poll are going to be, because I don't know how you choose. To me, it just seems like all of these things are important.
Absolutely.
So be curious to see what people say. We will be sharing the results later in the stream, Cherie, I think. So, as we said earlier, a lot's been happening since the weekend, and every day, minute by minute, something new seems to be happening. We need someone to bring us up to speed, and that person is Pablo Foley, Elias. Pablo?
That's right. It has been very hectic, very fast-moving. You really summarised it very well there. And particularly in the past few days, we've seen a lot of developments and a lot of names out there as well. So it's sort of, you know, it's a confusing situation for people who haven't been following it closely. So this is why I'm here.
It would be a crazy week to go on a news diet.
Absolutely.
You would be stuck in 2019 probably if you hadn't read the news since last Wednesday.
So basically, you know, to bring people up to speed, we've seen these scenes of jubilation in Syria itself and among the Syrian diaspora across the world, you know, people celebrating the fact that we've seen this sweeping change to Syria that led to President Bashar al-Assad fleeing the country. This, of course, has been led by the rebel group Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS for short. You're going to hear that throughout the chat today. today. The HTS leader, Mohammed al-Golani, he arrived in Damascus. We saw these jubilant scenes, and he said that to Syrians, the future is ours. Now, Assad's departure essentially led to these incredible scenes that we're seeing, which I don't think any of us expected, even if you'd asked us 2 weeks ago that this would be happening. And, of course, we have a lot of Syrians living abroad as well. Now, what does the future hold for Syria? Of course, that's a massive question, which we're going to be trying to look at today. What we do have at the moment is we have a Syrian caretaker prime minister, that is Mohammed al-Bashir. He'd previously been the head of the administration in that ran Idlib province, which is up in northwestern Syria. Who's in the interim government? Well, speaking to Al Jazeera about the interim government, I'm going to quote al-Bashir. He said, "We invited members from the old government and some directors from the administration in Idlib and its surrounding areas in order to facilitate all the necessary works for the next 2 months until we have a constitutional system to be able to serve the Syrian people." So in many ways, actually, just that statement in itself is giving us some type of indication of what direction we're headed in. Of course, there's a lot of hope among Syrians that there will be a period of peace and stability. In fact, al-Bashir said that too. He said to Syrians that what they need is a period to enjoy stability and calm after 14 years of war. Now,
if I could actually just interrupt you real quick, precisely on point is Hay'at Tahrir, who was in the chat just now asking, we'll get to this later,
Yeah,
I don't want to throw you off course here, but this is, he's talking, the new leaders, supposed leaders of Syria now are talking about how to move on, but Hay'at Tahrir asks, how can Syria progress when 1/3 of the territory, I haven't fact-checked that, but certainly a significant portion of the territory is still under Kurdish control, the northern portion under Turks, and in the southern portion, there's still fighting going on there. Israel is still has been bombing recently there, so the war is not over. And to talk about moving on and peace and everything, probably a little bit premature on that.
Probably a little bit premature, but it's sort of an indication of where they want to go. And obviously, you know, this is early days. We have a lot of questions that we need to ask. And you said Israel there. Now, let's not forget that Israeli warplanes have actually been carrying out hundreds of airstrikes across Syria. What have their targets been? Mainly Syrian army. Military facilities, we're seeing images here, weapons warehouses, ammunition depots, naval bases too, research centres, airports. Now, Israel has said that they're doing this to avoid weapons falling into, quote, hands of extremists. There's also the news that Israel has said it's going to keep a limited number of troops in what had been a demilitarized zone, buffer zone known as the area of separation in an area of the Golan Heights, because what they said what had happened was that Syrian troops had actually abandoned that area. The UN has said that this was a violation of a 1974 disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria. Very complex situation there as well. I'm sure we'll be touching on it too. And many countries have condemned the move by Israel. Many Arab countries in particular, but also Israel, also Turkey too. Which brings me on, of course, to Turkey, because Turkey is playing an important role here as well. They've been a key ally of the rebels in Syria. Interestingly, the rebel group HTS is listed as a terror organisation by Ankara, but Turkey has actually also operated alongside it in northern Syria and also holds, it's believed, some level of influence there. Another question that we can put to Dorian too, I think,
Exactly.
today.
We'll be speaking to him shortly. While you're talking, should we just bring up a map to see where things stand in Syria so that people can just follow along as to what the ground reality as of today is? I mean, just to sort of look at these Kurdish areas that we're talking about.
Getting it up
so
there.
That's the map there that should be coming up. And there
you can see it. So there's the HTS-led rebel groups there, like you were asking there before about the comment, the Kurdish and Syrian Democratic Forces there. You know, and then down in the far southwestern corner, just down past Damascus, is actually the Golan Heights area where I was talking about before. So, you know, and then we have the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army too. This is, you know, a very complex situation. I think we were talking about this before we went to air when we were covering the war in Syria, you know, in greater detail several years ago. You know, we got very familiar with all these different names and these areas and the complexity of it. So, you know, the question is, how is this new interim government going to bring all these elements together and push the country into a peaceful future?
I think if you can just throw that map up again, it's just worth pointing out to people that on the map it was three neatly divided areas with three somewhat homogeneous sounding groups. But then we will try and bring that map up whenever that's possible. But then, like it says, the clue is in the HTS-led rebel groups, the Syrian Democratic Forces. It's not one cohesive army. You're talking about agglomerations of different rebel groups, different forces, armed groups joining together to loosely form a group that is headed by one leadership. So you have this challenge of disparate groups as well.
Stefan Uterbrook points out that they need to reconcile with the Kurds first. I think reacting to our poll question there, that seems to be probably a priority in order to bring peace to the
and I think one thing that I really want to mention as well with regards to Turkey before I kind of forget and it goes out of my mind that, you know, it's home to 3 million Syrians. This is also a massive domestic issue in Turkey too. So there is also an interest in, you know, in finding a solution there from Turkey.
I mean, there's lots of discussion when it comes to Turkey and the Kurds, and that is something that we are going to be doing as we go along. But let's just start talking about Turkey first and general Turkish interests here. Let's bring in a long-time DW correspondent in Turkey, Dorian Jones, who joins me now on the line. Dorian, good to see you. Let's just start with what's been happening on the ground in Syria. I'm talking about the Israeli airstrikes that have been happening on the ground. There has been a response from Ankara, hasn't it? What is Ankara saying?
Well, Ankara is very uneasy about not only the sustained airstrikes, which has seen effectively the wiping out of much of the Syrian armed forces on the ground, but also the military presence of Syrian forces inside Syria. Now, this is really causing a great deal of unease. There's been a very harsh statement coming out of Ankara condemning what they say is accusing Israel of exploiting a vacuum in Syria to take advantage of the situation. And this comes also within the context that Israel recently, in fact, last month, the new foreign minister, Gideon Saar, identified the Kurds across the region as Israel's natural ally. And the Israeli foreign minister directly referred to the Syrian Kurds in particular, who he said were suffering the oppression of Turkey. Now, this set alarm bells ringing in Ankara. There's a big fear in Ankara that Israel could somehow be using the Syrian Kurds as a way to put pressure on Turkey, given the fact that relations between Ankara and Israel are very, very strained at the moment. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Turkish President Erdogan frequently exchange insults with one another, and relations are at a very, very strained point. Now, fear in Turkey is that possibly Israel could use its presence in Syria to carve out some kind of supply route to supply the Syrian Kurds and back them in their stand against currently forces that are being backed by Turkey in this ongoing fight that's still continuing in Syria and possibly could involve HTS going forward if talks aren't successful in unifying the country.
So can we go back up just real quick and explain why Turkey does not support the Kurds? I know that for a lot of people who have been following this closely, that might be obvious, but it would be good to just give that background to explain that that situation.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the Syrian Democratic Forces is, as you correctly described, is a coalition of forces, and one of the main part of that force is the YPG. Now, Ankara says that is directly affiliated to the PKK, which has been fighting the Turkish state for decades in a prolonged conflict that still continues to this day. And Ankara says that this force in Syria is directly linked to the PKK. And they even claim that they've been launching attacks into Turkey against the Turkish state, most recently last month near the capital, Ankara. Now, the YPG, the SDF deny this. They say we're not involved in any way. But Ankara is adamant. They say that these two groups in Syria and the PKK are directly linked, and this is a joint threat. They've called this the PKK-YPG terrorist front. And that is why Ankara says they are determined to end what they say is this existential threat on its border. And this is also further complicated because the SDF-YPG are supported by Washington. There is a small American military force in that region, which is part of the war against the Islamic State. And Washington is very concerned that the Islamic State could reemerge, taking advantage of the power vacuum in Syria. So Washington is still giving a message that they are still prepared to support the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, SDF forces. And they say those forces the American forces will remain. But President Trump is due to take office next month, and that could all change. There's a lot of eyes looking on Washington, too, in the coming weeks as well.
You know, while we're talking, let's just bring that map up so people can follow along and just generally place where the geographical placement of the SDF. Well, there's a different map that we have. That's generally showing the entire Kurdish population across 4 different countries. But it'll be good to maybe show where the SDF stands in relation to this Kurdish population, particularly in Syria. So we can bring that map up when it comes. But then, if I can just take a step back and ask you, Dorian, is the Turkish interest in Syria primarily to do with the Kurdish forces on its border, or is there something more?
I think it appears that there are 2 key priorities for Ankara. One is what they see as this existential threat, this presence, what they say is this very powerful terrorist force on its border, which continues to pose a threat, and they say that that has to be addressed. But the second equally important issue is that Turkey is hosting anywhere between 3, 4, possibly 5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. And for President Erdogan, this has become an increasing political liability. The patience of much of the Turkish public is really at an end. You're talking about maybe it's possibly 1-2 million here in Istanbul. And there has been a lot of tensions building up. The public really just say they've had enough because Turkey is going through a very difficult economic crisis. Inflation is near 70, 80, some people say maybe 100%. So for Erdogan, the downfall of Assad could not have come at a better moment because they see this as a way of returning Syrian refugees back to Syria. But key to that will be what kind of Syria emerges, because I think a lot of people feel that these refugees will not leave, particularly ones who spent many years here in Istanbul, carved a life out for themselves, they have homes. Many children haven't even lived in Syria. Will they want to return to Syria until they're sure that it is safe place to live?
I just want to there's 2 parts to this. One about Ankara being pleased that the Assad regime has ended, and the second, that it's hoping that the refugees in Turkey go back to Syria. Let's just take up the first point. When you say that Ankara is pleased that the Assad regime has fallen, if that is indeed the case, why was Ankara encouraging Assad till a few months back to actually negotiate with the rebels and come to some sort of a peace and some sort of an understanding? Because that is what Ankara was trying to do till a few months back. And then in this last month, it appears that Ankara changed its strategy. So what exactly was the thinking here with Ankara?
Well, I think Ankara, like with much of the international world and the neighbors, they felt that Assad had won. They felt that this uprising against Assad had been defeated. The rebels were just holed up just on the Turkish border. The big fear was that Assad, backed by Russia, would make one big more push into Idlib, which was their last stronghold, and there'd be another 2-3 million Syrian refugees crossing into Turkey. There really was a feeling that the conflict had ended, and Erdogan really wanted to open a dialogue with Assad because they believe that, we have to approach an endgame. You have to remember, Assad was being slowly introduced back into the international communities. Various Arab states were hosting Assad at various meetings, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, all of them to varying degrees were reaching out to Damascus because there was this feeling that the civil war was over. But what happened was that Assad, on several occasions, rejected Erdogan's overtures in a very public way. And one of his reasons, he said, was, I won't meet Erdogan until all the Turkish soldiers leave Syria. And for the Turkey, that wasn't going to happen. And Erdogan made that very clear. So there was deadlock. And even Erdogan turned to his ally, Putin, and said, can you put some pressure on Assad? Please, we want to talk. And it appeared all of that failed. When that failed, what we understand is that Ankara, behind the scenes, it has its own Syrian force, the Syrian National Army, which has been armed and supporting. It gave what it's understand is the green light for some operation against Aleppo, possibly also in coordination with the HTS, although Ankara firmly denies that isn't true. But many people I've spoken to behind the scenes said that there was some at least tacit approval from Ankara to go ahead with this operation against Aleppo. And the feeling was that will put more pressure on Assad to return to the negotiating table. What no one expected was the complete capitulation of the Syrian army. And I think Ankara was absolutely shocked, along with the rest of the world. They couldn't believe how quickly Assad's army collapsed. And Ankara has been playing catch-up ever since. And I think they're still, at this moment, they are still trying to get ahead of the curve, as it were, because there is a concern about what kind of Syria is going to develop, because they really want a stable Syria on its border.
And it is on this point, sorry, and I wanted to bring in the HTS element here. I mean, the Turks were supporting the Syrian National Army and different factions within it, but there has been no real proof that it's been doing so with HTS. With HTS being the biggest player on the ground in Syria right now, how much influence does Turkey really have on HTS to be able to affect some sort of change that Ankara favors?
Right, and Zayden commented, put it in a more simple way probably, Syria has not gained its freedom. It's gone from Russia-Iranian rule to Turkish-Qatari rule. Maybe you can comment on that, because what you just said seemed to contradict it, that Turkey didn't really know what was happening and didn't have that much influence over HTS.
Well, like you said at the beginning, I mean, HTS is an internationally designated terrorist organization by Washington. In fact, I think the leader had a bounty on his head by the Americans. I mean, so it was always very difficult for Ankara to officially admit to any dialogue with HTS because it's a terrorist organization. But having said that, the Idlib area where the HTS was based, that is on Turkey's border. It only survived because Turkey kept its borders open, food convoys went in, and various other supplies possibly as well. And also Turkey had a military presence in Idlib. Now that effectively was part of a deal brokered between Russia and Damascus to prevent further attacks against Idlib, because Turkey's fear was that would lead to more refugees into Turkey. For Turkey, that was a red line. So they had military forces in Idlib. They had intelligence forces for sure on the ground. And I mean, I think everyone admits, even if they don't say it publicly, they talk to one another. They had to talk to one another to make the coordinations on the ground, supplies, etc. How far those coordinations were, well, I think the historians will write that in the future. But I'm speaking to people, speaking off the record. They say for sure that there was communications and talks, but how much control they had on this, that is impossible to confirm one way or another. But I think everyone was surprised at the speed of HTS's success. And I think Ankara has been playing catch up. Now, for sure, there is goodwill because the HTS will remember Turkey was really one of the few countries that stood by them for all those years when everyone had written them off, when even their Saudi backers, their Arab backers were slowly pulling away. So there is that pool of goodwill, but that's the past. I mean, I think looking forward, they will be looking to the Gulf states for money because they need to rebuild their country. And the person that has the money will undoubtedly, to a certain extent, be calling the tune going forward. But for sure, Ankara does have influence, and that's why the US Secretary of State is expected to be visiting Turkey in the coming days, and why you've had the head of the EU, van der Leyen, speaking with Erdogan, the Italian Prime Minister speaking. Erdogan is one of the people to go to at the moment because there is this belief that they do have some contacts with HTS, but how much they have an influence in the future of Syria, that remains to be seen.
Nilay Chaturvedi commenting again says, isn't Turkey the only one to come out of this with positives?
Well, I think for Erdogan, he's jubilant. I mean, you can see from his body language, he's needed a success for a long time because the economy is in real trouble. There was all this anger and unrest over the presence of the Syrians. There was this condemnation that Turkey's policy of backing the rebels for all these years was a disaster. It failed. It cost Turkey so much money, lost so much goodwill on so many levels. But now, within the space of 2 weeks, everything has changed. Erdogan is now seen as a winner, and what is more, his prestige and importance going forward is on the rise, particularly possibly with the Trump administration coming in next month. That can be very important because it is a reminder to Trump that even though Trump wants to pull out of all these places, Turkey is an important player and possibly can help the Americans pull out of this with the expectation that the incoming President Trump wants to focus on China rather than the Middle East. So for sure, at the moment, Turkey and President is a very happy man, but this is for now. These events can change very quickly. If Syria falls apart into more turmoil and conflict, then he may not be so happy. But for the moment, he's enjoying that moment in the spotlight and seen as having a major diplomatic victory, which is playing very well with his supporters and in the country in general.
You know, we're talking about Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan so much. Let's just hear from him. Let's just hear what he has had to say recently about the events in Syria. We have a soundbite from him. And I believe Wade might have queued that up for us.
Right, and just to warn you, he never really sounds that jubilant. He's not a jubilant kind of guy.
Let's listen to the soundbite.
Judge this based on his previous comments.
Turkey has no eye on the territory of any other country. The only aim for our cross-border operation is to save our citizens and our homelands from the terrorist attacks. Neither the PKK and its extensions in Syria nor ISIS are the representatives of our country. On the contrary, they are its enemies. The territorial integrity of Syria should be protected at all costs.
So Dorian, based on what Erdogan was saying over there, talking about the territorial integrity of Syria being protected at all costs and warning against the PKK and its extensions in Syria, what is the message here that Erdogan is delivering?
Well, I think the message is that he's not prepared to continue with the status quo as he sees it, the presence of the YPG. And let's remember, they control hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of the Syrian-Turkish border. This area accounts for about a third of Syria. And for Ankara, they just say that this ongoing presence of what they see as an extension of a terrorist organization fighting Turkey is unacceptable. But the problem for Erdogan is his forces, the Syrian National Army, who have been fighting the YPG and the SDF, the Kurdish forces, have scored a number of success. They've taken key towns of Tel Rifat and now Manbij, but now they're reaching the Euphrates River. Now, what we understand is, from behind the scenes, Washington has been giving messages saying that you cannot cross over the Euphrates. That is as far as you can go. That's what has been the message in the past, and it doesn't. And all the messages coming out of Washington doesn't appear to be any change on that.
That's
so
the message
Ankara
to Turkey,
really does have.
Or to the Kurds.
Yeah, that's the message to Turkey, and to Turkey and the Syrian National Army, which Turkey's backing. They've reached the river. Now, will they cross that river? If they do that, that is where the American forces are placed. Now, they are very small, but still, for the Americans, they will be very, very sensitive about this. And I think that will be possibly one of the issues that will be discussed if, as expected, the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, does come here very soon. This will be an issue that will be discussed. What Ankara will do, it's really unclear, because some people I've spoken to close to the government, they do see this as an opportunity, because Russia, which was another country that was supporting the Syrian Kurdish forces, they are out of the scene, as are the Iranians, which too have provided tacit support as well. So there is this window of opportunity for some. They see in Ankara, we have a chance to sweep this threat, create this, they've been talking about for many months, a security cordon, something like 30, 40 kilometers deep into Syria, which will push back the Syrian Kurdish forces away from Turkey's border. But that is where all the main towns are for the Syrian Kurds. They have nothing but desert to go to. So that is seen as a very problematic demand. But I think that it's, for now at least, and it's unclear whether Ankara would be prepared to have a crisis with Washington over this. They may be waiting until Trump comes into power next month. Trump in the past has been very much more sympathetic to Erdogan's calls of ending US support. If the US support goes, then Ankara really feels that they'll have an opportunity then with its forces to sweep the Syrian Kurds. But it remains to be seen. It also has a lot to do with what's happening in Damascus. And one other key factor you have to remember is that where this region that the Syrian Kurdish forces are controlling, that is where all of Syria's oil is.
Right.
And Syria has oil supplies, and they would be seen as very key, the revenues for that, helping rebuild Syria. For now, at least, the Syrian Kurds and Syrian Democratic forces and this coalition of Arab forces too controls these valuable oil and also a large part of Syria's wheat supplies as well. In many ways, this area is the breadbasket. So this is a very important strategic area as well.
Let's just put that map up so people can follow along and just generally look at why this is such a contested area. Now, that's Syrian Democratic Forces, mainly with the Kurds in their ranks, and that's the one in yellow. Dorian, I'm assuming you're being able to look at this map as well. The Syrian National Army, as you were saying yourself, has been clashing with the Syrian Democratic Forces in certain towns and cities like Manbij. Just talk to us about the Turkish calculation here. If these clashes continue, let's say, what does that mean for stability in Syria? Because presumably Ankara would want some sort of a stable Syria so that people can leave Turkey and go back to Syria. But if these kinds of clashes continue between the Kurds and the Syrian National Army, where does that stability end up?
Well, that's the question some people raise, that these two key priorities for Ankara in some ways contradict one another. The security issue versus the return of refugees. As you say, if there's another major conflict, that would appear to make it more difficult for refugees to return. But like I said, for Ankara, there is this possible perception with this transition of power, when everyone is trying to make realities on the ground, there isn't a window of opportunity here to push further, to push and weaken the Syrian democratic forces, the Syrian democratic forces further and further. And before things solidify, before there's a strong government or some kind of government in Damascus, because it's unclear how the HTS will react to this growing Turkish military presence, even though they're using proxies. How comfortable will they be feeling about this going forward as well?
And just on this point that you made earlier about Turkey wanting to have this 30 to 40 kilometer deep buffer zone on the border with Syria. I mean, this is not a new demand, is it, Dorian? I think the last time I heard about this was, 2016, correct me, 2016 or 2017. This was, and that's, I think, around the time that Turkish troops entered northern Syria. So in the past 6 years, they haven't been able to create that 30, 40 kilometer buffer zone. How will they do that in the next few months?
Well, the reasons why they haven't was because there were other powerful players on the ground. You had the Russians there, you had the Iranians also there, and also you had the United States. And it was one of the few events where you had both Moscow and Washington and Tehran all on the same page saying that we don't want the Turks going into Syria. And so, in fact, given that kind of pushback from all these powers at the same time, Ankara was forced to make a compromise, and that map shows what effectively the compromise is. Now you're talking about the fact that, to a certain degree, Tehran and Moscow are out of the picture, and also you have a transition of Washington between one presidency and another. There is this potential window, although, like I said, Erdogan is putting a lot of store in the previous close relationship he developed with Trump in the past, and possibly he may be waiting for a few weeks and say, look, let me talk to my friend, President Trump. Let's talk this through, and we come to a deal where Washington is on the same page as us. I think that could well be the calculation.
Speaking of Washington, I promised to get to this comment earlier when we introduced the show. It's a Games asked very early on, why is Turkey part of NATO? And I think that's important context here to explain why it's a part of NATO and how that complicates this whole situation here.
Well, Turkey was one of the earliest members of NATO. Its membership goes back all the way back to the 1950s when Turkey was on the front line in the Cold War. Turkey was a pivotal country in NATO's standing up to the threat of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. And it was crucial to the success in many ways, that they managed to stand firm against the pressures throughout those very difficult decades. So in many ways, Turkey's membership goes back to the Cold War. Now, with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been a lot of discussions on and off. In many cases, Turkey's interests in many ways don't match what many of its NATO partners have. And there have been these ongoing contradictions. And what is Turkey's role? Where does it fit in with the general strategies of NATO, which it finds at many times at odds? But at the end of the day, there's absolutely no chance that Turkey would ever leave NATO, because it knows that NATO has to act in unanimity. And for Ankara to be inside the tent, it's much better than to be outside of it when key decisions which would have a very important impact on it in the future. So Turkey will be within NATO. And it has to be said, Turkish forces have participated in many NATO operations. In Afghanistan, it led the NATO operations on several occasions. It has peacekeeping forces in Kosovo, in the Balkans. It's usually one of the first countries to put troops up for NATO operations in difficult places. So while it can be a difficult partner from time to time, it's also many times been a very supportive partner, because it has the second largest army in NATO.
Dorian, stay with us on the line because I think now is the right moment to bring in Natasha Hall, a Syria analyst. She is with the Middle East program at the Washington, D.C.-based think tank CSIS. That's the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Now I see you, Natasha. Thanks so much for making the time. I don't know if you got some of the discussion we were having with Dorian Jones, our correspondent in Turkey, but we were talking basically about Turkey within the NATO framework and also potentially clashing when it comes to aims when it concerns the United States. So let's just pick up on that point. Dorian was talking about Turkey trying to maybe change facts on the ground before Donald Trump is inaugurated as president. How does Donald Trump's presidency, how would Donald Trump's presidency impact the calculations in Syria, given that I think he recently posted the United States should get out of Syria?
Right. No, I think it's a great question, and thanks for having me. So essentially, I think President-elect Trump's inclination is to withdraw his troops, and he did that, or he tried to do that in 2019 as well. That said, his newly incoming administration has everyone from Tulsi Gabbard to Marco Rubio. So Marco Rubio being much more of a hawk, less of an isolationist, and Tulsi Gabbard having, met with Bashar al-Assad actually, and very much against quote unquote regime change wars. But I do think that President-elect Trump's inclination is not to be involved. Now, that said, U.S. troops, as small as they might be, with 900, are quite a mighty presence in Syria and essentially kind of create a wedge of protection, I think, for Kurdish communities and Kurdish troops within the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that's really important for three major reasons. One of them being that they guard ISIS prisons in northeastern Syria. So we still have thousands of ISIS fighters there, and the SDF are the primary guards of those prisons. And they have played their card when they feel vulnerable to somewhat, I think, allow for smaller prison breaks. So that's something to be cognizant of. The other, as your other speaker had mentioned, this is the area of oil wealth and agricultural wealth in Syria. About 70% of agricultural wealth, 70% of oil wealth in Syria is in the sort of Kurdish-controlled areas. And then finally, in recent days, the SDF had actually taken control of the Al-Bukamal border crossing with Iraq, which is also really essential for establishing Syria's security and ensuring that Iranian-backed militias don't go back and forth. So without a doubt, I think Turkey, feeling like the winner in all of this and these momentous events of the past few days, is trying to work with its Turkish-backed militias to essentially snag as much territory as possible before anyone else kind of comes into the fray, in order to sort of mitigate a security threat for it, but I think also return refugees, potentially. And I would say that the SNA is also probably trying to instigate some kind of land grab so that they have more potential in Syria's future as well, more bargaining leverage.
You talked about, you and Dorian talked about all this wealth that is in SDF-controlled areas, and that the U.S. is backing them. The U.S. relies on them as a partner to control the Islamic State as well, and also protect these prisons. Given all of these things that are going in favor of the SDF, Natasha, would now be the time for the Kurds to say, okay, now is the time we get our own independent homeland?
I think that would send the entire region up into a tizzy. So, it's not just Kurds that are in Syria, but there are massive Kurdish populations in Iraq, in Iran, in Turkey, and in Syria. And so, any kind of additional sort of Kurdish autonomy also, I think, makes other countries very uncomfortable. And so I think that could potentially put them in an even more vulnerable position, and not just with Turkey, who would have a lot to say about that, but also I think other Syrians that really want to see, I think, a unified Syria. And I would guess that the SNA and HTS, the rebel group that sort of led the charge into Damascus, would also have something to say about Kurds taking all of that wealth of the country.
We have a comment from where is it? Andrei Skok. He asked, do you think this new situation can possibly change the situation of Kurds in Turkey, Iraq, and Iran as well?
So I think that would be very challenging. We have, 4 very, very different regimes in all of these different countries. We have Turkey that's been fighting a decades-long battle with the PKK. This is the group, the Kurdish group that they consider to be a terrorist organization, and the United States has also designated a terrorist organization. Iran has also had a very confrontational past with the Kurds in their country, and same goes for Iraq, that suffered under chemical weapons attacks actually under Saddam Hussein. So they have very hard-fought autonomy there as well. But they've also fought quite hard to have some kind of alliance with Turkey to maintain their security and their autonomy within Iraq. So it's actually a very, very complicated picture for the 30 million Kurds that sort of straddle all of these borders. So it would be very challenging, I think. Unfortunately, the Kurds are very reliant on the United States for protection at this time.
And can you just briefly tell a little bit more why the Kurds have been able to capture the hearts and minds of a lot of people in the West? I know, especially among leftists in Europe and the US, the experiment with Rojava in the north of Syria became somewhat of an icon, the only good guys in the fight. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can elaborate a little bit. I mean, I think that there is this sort of socialist inclination from, a lot of people in the West that this was this progressive sort of enclave in Syria. You had the YPJ, so this is the sort of female equivalent of the YPG. So these are the Kurdish armed forces that were created in Syria. And I think a lot of people were quite enamored with this sort of brigade of women fighters. That said, the YPG and the YPJ have also committed human rights violations. Even other Kurds have said that they have handed them over to the regime, for example, or threatened to hand them over to the Syrian regime when it was still in power. And so they have also built up many enemies as well, and they have not really been able to distance themselves from the PKK, despite U.S. overtures to do so over the years.
Natasha, stay with us on the line because I'd like to throw the next one to Dorian, who's been listening in. Dorian, given that Turkey and the SDF don't see eye to eye, and that's an understatement there, what is Turkey's best case scenario for the SDF? What does Turkey expect will happen to the SDF in this new Syria that where the HTS currently is making transitional government arrangements? What does it expect will happen with the SDF? Will they just disappear or will they merge with the HTS? What does Turkey want?
Well, I mean, officially, they basically say they have to give up all their arms and surrender, as is the same message of the PKK, and that is the bottom line for that. But having said that, I think that what they will be looking for, and that has been the message that Erdogan's been making, we're committed to the integrity of Syria. So I think they will be looking for the SDF to merge, like you suggest, with the HTS in some form, with their military forces to also join up with the HTS. Or what's future Syrian government. I think, would that be enough for Ankara? I think they would also look for severing all ties with the PKK. That's something they say that they have done, but I think there's a lot of disbelief on that. They certainly believe that there is still ongoing contact between the two. It's still very unclear, but I think that if they disarmed and they join the HTS, that probably would be enough. And most thing is that the border of Syria is controlled by probably Syrian national forces, some new army that would be created, or better still, the HTS or someone along that line controlling the border between Turkey and Syria. That's the most important thing for Ankara. They want that border secure. But will that be enough going forward? It's really unclear, because I think the fact that the events have happened so quickly with the collapse of the Assad regime, they too are playing catch up as well in shaping up what kind of demands that they want going forward. So it's still very much a moment of flux here, and the ongoing negotiations with Washington, with the present administration and the new one coming will be probably key to determining Turkey's final position on that.
But just based on the conversations that you've had with people in Turkey, is there any appetite, for example, for to have the Turkish army step back from the areas in Syria where they are and have been for the past few years?
Well, in fact, that's something when I've spoken to a lot of experts and former diplomats and said that Ankara's military presence in Syria will be something that's going to be increasingly under question, particularly when you have a new government forming in Damascus, given the fact that now Russia is away out of the scene, the Iranians are out of the scene. Other than the Israelis, who the Israelis say it's only a temporary presence, Turkey is the only other country that has a large military presence and controls a large part of Syria. Now, Ankara up until now has ruled out any withdrawal until what they say is the terrorist threat is removed. Now, that stance going forward, if there is some agreement with the Kurdish forces, then that presence, the Turkish presence in Syria will be increasingly under question. And what Turkey's stance will be on that is something that they seem to be very reluctant to talk about at the moment.
Dorian, we'll leave it there for the moment with you. Thanks so much for joining this discussion today. I'm sure we'll be talking quite soon, given the developments in Syria. Thanks so much for your time today, Dorian. I'd like to come to you, Natasha. Earlier, we were talking about these clashes that are happening between the Syrian National Army and the Syrian Democratic Forces, particularly in the town of Manbij, for example, and certain other areas. Do you see these clashes continuing for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think until there is some kind of clarity, unless there is a U.S. administration that comes in that has something to say about it, I do suspect that after having expelled Kurdish forces from Tel Rifat and Manbij, they will continue to march eastward into Raqqa with Turkish support. They've been using Turkish drones, for example. And as I said, I think the SNA has a part to play in that and are using sort of their own ambitions here, too, to grab as much land as possible as a bit of leverage in a future Syria. I think that the issue with the next U.S. administration is, I think, again, President-elect Trump's inclination is to withdraw troops. If they withdraw troops, the SDF is in a lot of trouble. On all fronts, essentially. So I think that it would lend a great deal of instability to Syria at this moment, but it's unclear whether or not, like in 2019, Trump's generals and advisors will be able to convince him otherwise at this time.
Natasha, stay with us on the line, because I think now is the time to just sort of get a check on what the community has been saying on the live stream. And Cherie, you can jump in with some comments on that.
Yeah, the chat has been very lively. Many people comment on the situation. And I see that many people actually have a lot of knowledge about what's happening there in Syria. But what I see also is that many people are very skeptical about the future of Syria. There are questions about peace in Syria. For example, there's one user, D, saying that unless minority rights, which is responding to our poll question, has been ensured, there will be no more stability in the Middle East. There's also questions about peace for the Kurds in Syria. Someone said that you can't ignore the way Turkey has treated the PKK and the Kurds people. So there are skepticism about both situations. I think also what's important to bring up is that someone has repeatedly commented that the PKK is not the Kurds. So maybe in our discussion, or we can ask our experts to clarify this and how we can distinguish the two groups when we are commenting on this.
Let's just ask Natasha. Natasha, I don't know if you got all of that, but then there's certain comments in the live stream in which somebody's insisting that the PKK, that Turkey considers a terrorist organization, is not the Kurds. Is that factually correct?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are Kurds in different political groupings. There's even dozens of political groupings for the Kurdish people. It's not just the PKK. I think the critical question, though, for Syria, and it has been for some time, is how much the YPG, which is sort of the exclusively Kurdish predecessor to the SDF, how much it can actually delink itself from the PKK. Now, I've met with General Mazloum. He is the commander of the SDF. He's a very pragmatic, diplomatic person. But I suspect that he is under a lot of restraint from Kandil. This is sort of the mountainous hub, sort of headquarters of the PKK. And I suspect they would, frankly, assassinate him if he went too far away from them. And so, I mean, you've seen the United States try to get the YPG to distance itself from the PKK over the years. But still, if you go into this territory, there's There's, posters and pictures of Öcalan everywhere, who is the head of the infamous head of the PKK. So I think that this is the ultimate tragedy of Syria, right? Because no one is really able to focus on Syria because they all have to focus on all of these other, actors, even before they can cannibalize themselves in any kind of future Syria. Others are already devouring them. You see Israel mounting this offensive and taking Mount Hermon in the south. You see the SNA making advances in the north. So, I mean, this has been ongoing for a long time.
It's a scramble for a power vacuum, and we've seen that in several countries. We've had comments here that have compared Syria to what happened in Libya and other places. Do you feel like it's condemned to flounder like that, like Libya has for so long?
No, I mean, there's a critical distinction between Libya and Iraq and these other interventions. And I've heard this comparison made before. These were sudden coups and invasions of these countries that overthrew their leaders. It's not to say that their people loved Saddam Hussein or they loved Muammar Gaddafi. No, I mean, quite the contrary. But in the middle of somewhat stability for a country, they were sort of overthrown and chaos ensued. It's a different situation in Syria. I mean, we have just seen 13 years of brutal civil war where this regime and its allies have killed hundreds of thousands of people, disappeared 130,000 people. So there is kind of a unity that's forged in this crucible of just death and destruction. Now, that said, I do think because Syria is sort of this geographic key in the Middle East, and you see that on a map, right? It actually looks like a crossroads, right, in the middle of the Middle East. It borders Israel, it borders a NATO ally, it borders a place where the United States still has troops and recently invaded and occupied. So there's a lot of there's a lot of people that are trying to get their piece of the pie, right? So I think that this is less about Syrians, actually, who I do actually believe could potentially come together and forge a better future for themselves. But I do think it's a lot about outside powers that have always used Syria as sort of a playground for their own interests.
Speaking of Syrians, I mean, there is a Syrian who appears to be at least nominally in charge, or at least maybe more than nominally. We're talking about the HTS leader, Mohammed al-Golani, who's, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, gone back to his original name, Ahmed al-Shara. What do we know about him? Is he the next leader of Syria, or is he just somebody who will get the government going and take a back seat?
So this is the big question on most Syrians' minds, I think, right now, because no one could have seen this coming from Abu Muhammad al-Golani. He's clearly a very smart and ambitious, both militarily and politically, person. I mean, it doesn't take an ordinary person to be able to shed ISIS and Al-Qaeda and still somehow make it to leadership in Damascus. I mean, this is really truly, for whatever you think of him, and he is a man who has proven to be cruel and rule with brute force, but he is truly an incredible individual. And so I think that we should be quite nervous about what his political ambitions are. Now, he said in interviews that Syria should not just be for one sect. He said that it shouldn't be under, one leader. But I think without a doubt, he does have political ambitions. And so the next few, I think, days, weeks, months ahead are going to be really critical. HTS has said that they will sort of lead a transition government for 3 months. But we don't know what's going to come thereafter. And we don't know if they're going to let, for example, opposition and civil society figures that have also been working on the day after in Syria for, more than 13 years, frankly, in many cases, if they'll be allowed in and there'll be some kind of power sharing agreement. That said, I mean, HTS has left most government employees in their posts.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't generally go very well when it comes to, I don't know, Islamist rebels. When they suddenly take over, the governance gets left behind. But it's different with HTS, isn't it? Because they governed Idlib province, where they were for a number of years with the Syrian Salvation Government. Have I got that right? The SSG. And
That's
now,
right.
And now
Yeah.
Mohammed al-Bashir, who's now been appointed the head of the transitional government, was also a figurehead in that transitional government. Can you talk to us a bit about the HTS experience with actually governing a people?
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. So within Idlib, I mean, this is not an underground group. They have been, openly governing this enclave in northwest Syria for many years now. So we know quite a bit about their governing style. They have all of the typical ministries that you would think of for any kind of government. They tax people, which some people think is exploitation. Other people think is basically a basic government function, right? They set the prices of basic commodities. I mean, these really normal, I think, government functions. The question, though, is that, well, there's two points. One, the Syrian economy is in dire straits. I mean, throughout the country, 90% of people live under the poverty line. There's likely to be hundreds of thousands of people that want to return, and it's not clear that they will have homes to return to. And the Syrian currency has also collapsed. So HTS is going to have to control a much larger area, a much more heterogeneous area. And so that's going to be really, really challenging, especially if they're still designated as a terrorist organization.
Sumer BC comments and asks a question and alleges that HTS has carried out extrajudicial killings in hospitals. I'm obviously not able to confirm that, but we have seen very little in the media about retribution from HTS. But is there evidence that that's happening?
Right now on the ground, or you mean in Idlib when they once governed?
Since the takeover.
Since the takeover. So, I mean, what we do know is that just a few months ago, there were actually protests against HTS leadership in Al-Golani, primarily because of people that died in HTS custody. I'm unable to confirm anything about extrajudicial killings in hospitals. I haven't heard anything about that. Quite the contrary. I've heard that Damascus has kind of come back alive as, sort of a normal city without checkpoints. I do know that HTS and others are looking for those who are accused of war crimes, but they have given amnesty essentially to the rank and file.
So it does appear to be important to them that they preserve this image that they're open to cooperation with Western governments.
Absolutely. But I think that there's a really crucial point to make here, which is that even the U.S. government is not able, or the U.S. military, which is one of the most powerful militaries in the world, is not able to rein in all of its soldiers. We've seen a lot of violations in places like Afghanistan and Iraq that have been widely reported on. So I think the question, too, is there's a lot of people with arms in Syria, right? This is a country that is awash with arms. And so the question of extrajudicial killings, as your audience member has asked, is I mean, perhaps a legitimate one, but it doesn't necessarily mean that HTS is responsible.
At the end of the day, HTS is still an Islamist organization, is it not? And therefore, I wonder, what is the aim, or what kind of a government would HTS set up? Would it be an Islamist government looking at Sharia law? What kind of Sharia law? Are we looking at another Taliban-style version developing in Syria?
Yeah, I mean, well, we already know it's not going to be a Taliban-style sort of governance based on what HTS has done and said. They've told their members not to interfere in women's attire and looks. They've said that they're going to protect all minorities. And I don't have a doubt that they will, because even in Islamic governance, you protect Ahl al-Kitab, or people of the book. So, Christians, Jews, etc. I think the bigger question, to be honest, is politics, not religion. It's the desire for vengeance against the Alawite community, which is, Bashar al-Assad's sect. But that is, I think, less about religion and more about some of the war crimes, frankly, that many of them perpetrated. And so that's why you see a lot of people coming into Syria, but you do see some people leaving Syria because they are very fearful of any kind of retribution, and probably rightfully so. But in terms of Islamist leanings, in terms of, the governance, without a doubt, Al-Golani is a conservative person. I think the bigger question that we should be asking is HTS should not be governing Syria in the future. They have said that they would dissolve themselves. They have said that all militias should dissolve themselves into a regular Syrian military. There should be some kind of civilian government as well. and the Syrian people should choose what that is. Now, whether or not Al-Golani allows that to happen, that's something we're going to have to see in a couple of months' time, I think. But for now, they're saying and doing the right things.
What are the chances that this is a done deal now? Because we've had people commenting, Carolina Vilena, who she commented in our chat asking, will Russia meddle with Syria after granting asylum with Assad? So basically answering, is Russia really done with Syria now? Is Iran done with Syria now? We've had questions whether or not Assad supporters will try to mount a counter-revolution, so to speak. So is this a done deal, or are those things still things for the HTS to worry about?
I mean, I think that's another really great question, because I think the most stunning part of all of this, aside from the rapid, lightning fast advances of this rebel group to overthrow a leader within the span of about 10 days, is the complete abandonment of Bashar al-Assad by his allies, his stalwart allies, Russia and Iran, who have a lot to lose in him being deposed. For Iran, this interrupts their sort of route or corridor between Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean. So it has lots of Iranian-backed proxies in Iraq and, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this, significantly interrupts that path. And so their forward defense strategy is completely in tatters. In terms of Russia, strategically speaking, this is their first warm water port. They have an air base on the coast as well. But I think even more broadly than that, this was Russia's emergence into the world as a great power through their intervention in Syria. It made them a big player in the Middle East. And it got them a seat at the table, right? With a lot of U.S. allies. Even Foreign Minister Safadi in Jordan said, Russia is the most reliable partner we have. This is stunning, right? Especially in light of the Ukraine invasion and whatnot. So the big question is, what's in it for Iran and Russia having just sort of withdrawn so quite rapidly, right? And I think both of them have accepted the notion that they are in a weak and vulnerable position. Does that mean that they give up? I'm kind of doubtful about that. It seems like HTS is being extremely pragmatic and essentially allowing Russia to keep its bases, which I'll remind the audience about how pragmatic that is. Russia used these bases to kill thousands of Syrians, launching, attacks on civilian communities for many, many years. That's quite astonishing in and of itself. Whether or not they let them hold on to it for a long time, honestly, I wouldn't doubt it, because it does seem like HTS is being incredibly pragmatic. Now, whether or not they allow Iran to have any influence in the country, I think is more debatable, because I think in terms of the landscape that we're seeing right now, Israel coming in through the south, Turkey coming in through the north, I don't think there would be a lot of advantages to them politically to allow Iranians to regain a foothold in the country, because we've seen what that looks like in places like Iraq, and it's not great.
I just have one final question for you, Natasha, and this concerns the future of Syria. We have been discussing it, and we don't know which way it's going to go. But something struck me about what Al-Golani said over the weekend in Damascus. He called this victory, quote, a new chapter in the history of our Islamic nation. I just want to focus on that new chapter. You've been looking at the situation in Syria for more than a decade, and in this civil war has seen the emergence of groups with vested interests. You've had groups clashing with each other, and the idea of Syrian nationhood perhaps has been redefined. Do you get the impression now, irrespective of what HTS does, that most of the armed factions in Syria right now are of the same view that we need to build Syria? Or is it a case of we need to get what we can before Syria gets a functioning government? Is everybody on the same page?
I think that's an excellent question. Unfortunately, I think it might likely be the latter. But again, I think that's because of the imposition of outside interests, not necessarily Syrian interests. HTS had tried to get the SNA, for example, to focus on the regime offensive. But once again, they were somewhat forced to do Ankara's bidding. But there has been a lot of infighting, actually, especially between SNA militias I'll remind everybody that most of these militias, started in other parts of Syria, but were forcibly displaced by pro-regime forces. But even in their, locations, Faylaq Rahman and Jaish al-Islam and Eastern Ghouta used to fight a lot over territory. So this isn't anything particularly new. One hopes that people can, both inside and outside Syria, can look to a better and brighter and more unified future. Sa'adallah Wannus, the poet, the famous Syrian poet and writer, said that we're condemned to hope. So I think that's kind of the place we're still in for Syrians.
And we'll leave it there for the moment. Natasha Hall joining us from the CSIS think tank. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
That was a fantastic way to end that.
Condemned to hope.
Condemned to hope. I'm gonna keep that.
I like that. I'm going to keep that too.
I'm going to keep that. I'm going to. I forget the name of the poet that you mentioned, but I'm going to have to look it up.
Look back at the show.
On the on-demand show. We did have a poll that we announced at the start. I don't know if you've closed it, but I'm guessing we have.
I did, yes.
And maybe we have the results as well.
We do have the results.
What were the questions again? I forget. I need to look through my notes.
The question is, what should Syria's new rulers do first?
Yeah.
We actually have we have a tied result. So we have 499 votes, and 30% voted for negotiate with rebel factions. Another 30% voted for rebuild the economy, and 24% voted for ensure minority rights, and 14% said achieve international recognition is important.
Isn't this what we were expecting was going to happen? Because we put this question to ourselves, what do we choose over the other? It just seems, everything seems important.
Yeah, and I think we can't say that because very few people voted for ensure minority rights, that they don't think that that's important. But obviously the question is, which do you do first?
Exactly, yeah.
And I think a lot of people understand that stability comes before, I mean, you can't, not before in priority, but you can't protect minority rights if you just revert to civil war. And I think that everybody's conscious of that. I don't think anybody is under the illusion that they're going to have stability. Actually, Ernesto Matal Sol says stability, then the question mark with the exclamation point after that. It's an illusion because there are many interests from different countries and groups in Syria. It won't be an easy path to reach stability in Syria, but obviously Syria is condemned to hope.
It was fascinating what Natasha was saying there about, that the Syrians themselves, it's not really, Syrians aren't the issue, it's everyone else outside of Syria. That's really what's causing a lot of instability within the country. And I think that was a really kind of sobering thought,
and I think that was clear from 2011 already. I mean, just several months after the protests started, that was really the last moment there was unity in Syria with all the students and a lot of disgruntled workers who were dealing with the unemployment rate. A lot of people had just moved to the cities, and there was mounting poverty, and they had a revolution. It was a moment of absolute hope and unity, and Assad's brutality led to more protests, led to armed groups, and it was really within months that it kind of obliterated any illusion of unity there.
And of course, this element of pragmatism, which is coming up so often, I just think that's also so fascinating, and just to keep an eye on it, I mean, when Natasha was saying there about, how they're dealing with Russia, and I mean, it is, I mean, there were so many horrendous scenes that we saw over the course of the war. And to have that level of pragmatism, I mean, I just wonder how long it'll last.
Yeah, just to add more context to that, I mean, we're talking about Al-Golani, who's got a, I think, $10 million bounty from the United States on his head. The group is still recognized as a terrorist group in the US, UK, and it's, I think, also on UN lists, although I believe the UK is having some conversations about maybe removing that.
I don't think
again,
it'll be the first. I mean, there'll be plenty more.
Nothing is confirmed there. And the element of pragmatism that Natasha brought up, you think of this Islamist terrorist group that is also pragmatic. And what a commentary on where Syria is now. This very diverse nation in the Middle East, and where it is now, that somebody who heads an Islamist terrorist organization is being called pragmatic, and he might be one of the biggest power brokers, not the only one. To determine the future of Syria. Right. Should we call it quits on today's stream?
Yeah, and I really want to say thanks to everybody who commented. This was, from my perspective, really the best, highest quality comments and questions we've had. So keep them coming, really. We're going to be back next week. We always post in the community tab on our YouTube page about 24 hours before we go live on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Berlin time. That's where we're based, Central European time. So check our YouTube page for our next topic, and you can always start posting before we even have a show on that community tab.
And keep those engaging comments coming. Thanks to Pablo, thanks to Cherie for being at the big table with us. We will see you next week on a subject and a theme that we don't know of as yet. We need to decide that.
A lot can happen in a week.
You can suggest things.
As we've seen.
And a weekend.
You can suggest things too, so we'll look out for that.
We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.